all of our cities. Thank you very much for joining. And yes, just to go over the basic rules of the webinars, you have a mute and unmute button on the bottom left of your screen if you're connected from your computer, or if you're connected from a phone. To mute and unmute is *5. We would ask everyone kindly to stay on mute during the presentation. You will have time for questions at the end of the presentation by James. Or alternatively, you can write your questions down at any time in the chat box that you can see again at the bottom of your screen if you are connected from your computer. So as most of you know, as we have spoken recently, this year we're going to be doing a lot of work on money matters in waste, specifically looking at how to finance waste operations, both with regards to the initial investment and also with regards to the operating costs of running waste infrastructure in the longer term. When we, and this James will go through in greater detail, but it's very important to consider in waste infrastructure projects that the initial investment is not the end of the game. You haven't won when you have found the investment for the infrastructure, the money to build the infrastructure, because most of the costs will actually come later on as you operate the infrastructure. But I'm not going to do any spoilers for James's presentation. One other thing I was going to mention briefly is that you should have received the first newsletter sometime last week from Gisela. It contains some very useful materials and the links, including the workshop report. For those who participated in the workshop in Nairobi in December, there is a link to the report in the newsletter. As always, so if you didn't receive the newsletter, do email us and we'll send it to you. If you have the newsletter but aren't able to access the documents, once again, email us and we will make sure that you are able to read the workshop report and the other material that we are suggesting for you. So without further ado, I am going to introduce James. James Alexander is the director of the city finance team at C40. As most of you know, C40 operates in thematic areas, and city finance is actually an area that cuts across all of the sectors of C40. And so James's team looks at financing in different areas, so not just in waste, in renewable energies, in transport, and all of the other sectors that C40 is involved with. But today we have asked him to develop a presentation specifically with regards to waste, and specifically with regards to financing the initial cost of waste infrastructure. So we're going to take a look at what are the different ways of getting funds, and some useful advice and recommendations for each possible avenue. So once again, thank you very much, James, for joining us today, and I'm going to give the word over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Federico. It's really great to be on this webinar. Really appreciate your time and effort in organizing this, and see we have people from all over the world on the webinar as well, which is fantastic news. So welcome. Thank you for being part of this. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation now. With any luck, this will work. If you can just confirm, is that working? Is that showing?
It's very...
Yes, it is. If anyone is having trouble with the view, on top of your screen there's view options. Just next to the green bar, you can click on that and select fit to window if you think that your screen is too zoomed in or something like that. sometimes that happens with Zoom.
Okay. So if everyone's able to see that, if you're not, please write a comment in the chat box, and the team will help out. Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for joining. This is a webinar, as Federico said, looking at financing waste infrastructure and some of the major challenges that we have. We're going to go through looking at financing issues, then looking briefly at funding, and then looking in quite a lot of detail at public-private partnerships, which I know is a key area of conversation in the waste program right now, and something that we're keen to support. There is quite a lot of information in these slides, and so please do feel free to ask questions. I will also be available. I will leave my email address at the end of the presentation, and so please make sure, if you have further questions, I'd be very happy to hear from you, and we can get in touch afterwards to discuss things further. So just to start off with some of the basics on funding and financing. So this car is a Tesla. They've become quite popular in the UK, and it's one of the major electric vehicles that you see on the roads around London, which is where I live and where I am right now. If I wanted to buy a Tesla, which I'm rather envious of the people that own them, if I were to want to buy a Tesla, I'd need to figure out how I would pay for it. And the problem is that in the UK, at least, a Tesla costs £62,000, which is a huge amount of money, much more than I would be able to afford, sadly, on my own. And so if I want to get a Tesla, I have to figure out how to do it. And the reason why I'm giving you this example is because it is actually reflective. It's more of a real-world example that's reflective of how some of the infrastructure projects we need to think about are paid for. And it starts off thinking about some of the basics of funding and financing. And so in the UK, there is a subsidy program for electric vehicles. And so that would pay the first little bit of the vehicle for us. It's around about £5,000. So it's quite a lot of money, but it's nowhere near the full cost that I need. And so if I were to think about how I might get that vehicle, I need to start thinking through where is the money going to come from to pay the rest of it. And so if I were to get a loan for the remainder, which is 57,000, that process or that part would be called the financing. And to be honest, as far as Tesla's concerned, they're the company that sells the car. They don't care. Beyond that, they get the money in to pay for the car. They deliver the car, it arrives on my doorstep, and I get the keys, and I'm happy, they're happy, and they don't care at all how I'm going to repay that loan, because ultimately they've sold the car. They've made the transaction. I, as a person, as an individual, though, want to make sure that I don't go bankrupt, and it's very important for me that I figure out how I repay that loan. And so what I would be doing would be making repayments from my monthly salary to repay that loan. And those repayments would be regarded in this context as the funding of the program. So in all financial transactions that you're involved in, particularly where there's a loan component, what you need to look at is not just where the financing comes in, or where the money comes in to actually pay for the project in the first place, but you also need to look at how you repay that, and that's called the funding. And in fact, there's actually a third component which is equally important, and probably in waste programs even more important, which is how do I keep this car on the road? Because this car needs electricity, it needs servicing, it would need new tires every now and then. So if I can't afford or haven't thought about how I'm going to put those things into the car, particularly the electricity, the car's not going to run, and I'll have to be repaying for a car that I can't use. And those are called the operating costs. And so that might seem like a flippant example, and it kind of is a bit overly simplistic, but it broadly represents the things that we have to consider when we're looking at any type of project or developing any sort of project. How we're going to get the money in for the first place to build it, how we're going to get the money in to repay that, and how we're going to pay for operating it. And in fact, when it comes to waste projects in particular, really it's so important that we think very carefully about the operating costs, because in waste, the operating costs generally far exceed the actual cost of the creation of the initial infrastructure, which makes it quite a unique sector in that respect, but all the more important to consider the operating costs. And so then applying that further to urban finance and urban financing, you've got the project in the middle. On one side, you've got the financing, which is the different finance sources. And on the other side, you've got how that financing is repaid through funding. And so building further now, looking at the project financing options, we've got a few ways that project financing can come through. And I'm not specifically not talking about PPPs at this point. We were going to go on to that in a few minutes' time. So here we've got looking at own source revenues. We've got other sources of revenue for the city. Of course, debt is a key way to finance projects, equity, and then, of course, there's a combination of those. And I'm going to go through some of these in a bit more detail. So first of all, we're going to look at what the basic options are for urban infrastructure. Then we're going to think about what options the private sector can provide, what can be funded through international organizations, and then what can be funded through the public sector. And we're going to go through each of these areas in turn. And part of the purpose of this is to demonstrate there are a wide range of different options available, but at all times remembering that all this is about is financing the infrastructure and the original cost of the infrastructure. This is not about the ongoing operation and maintenance costs, which is really important to think through in any project that's being developed in the city. So looking at the basic options for urban infrastructure finance, you've got, of course, municipal revenues. What is the money that comes into the city that you could potentially use to pay for your project? And broadly, those are taxes, or there are other sources of finance. They could be fees, they could be tariffs, they could be charges, money that comes into the city in various different ways. That could be enough in some circumstances to pay for the project, often for smaller projects, and that might be enough. That might be fine. Of course, there are, moving down to intergovernmental transfers, there are opportunities for the city to receive money from other parts of government. So money from the national government, subsidies that promote a particular course of action. There are often different types of grants from national government, those that are earmarked, which are for specific purposes, or those that are unconditional or that are not for specific purposes. And then, of course, the other basic option is to borrow money and to take out some debt for the city. But, of course, remembering that must be repaid. The private sector can also come in here on a number of different ways. The kind of one of the more common ways is through debt. In a city context, that's often regarded through or kind of becomes apparent through bonds. Not every city has the power to issue bonds. In fact, not every city has the power to do some of these things, but that's okay. And I'll come on to that in a bit later on. So working through the private sector with bonds, there are different types of bonds. There are municipal bonds that the city can issue. You might have heard a bit about green bonds. We're not going to discuss that much further today, but if you are interested in hearing more about bonds, we've done some fact sheets that I can share with you, or I'm very happy to have a further conversation with people on this topic. Of course, other private sector elements include public-private partnerships, which we're going to go into in detail in a minute. There's investment funds, there's full privatization, which is really where you push the project fully into the private sector and the city no longer either owns or uses or operates that service. And there are a number of different ways of other private sector opportunities for financing infrastructure. International organizations can also help. We're going to talk a little bit later about development banks and the work that they do. And they offer concessional loans, which are loans at reduced rates or reduced cost of capital because of the way that they're set up. And that might be something that's very attractive for a lot of cities and of course, countries around the world are using development banks to support the infrastructure that they're developing. There's also finance facilities popping up around the world. They broadly focus on, sometimes it's technical assistance, sometimes it's concessional loans or funds to help move things forward in a very specific area. And so, for example, the C40 Cities Finance Facility provides technical assistance for C40 members to help them move forward specific projects. There's other different loans and equity and export guaranteed, which I'm not going to go into in too much detail. Something that is worth thinking about here is the green climate funds. There are increasingly growing throughout the world different types of green funds. The most prominent of these is the Green Climate Fund. That has quite a lot of money available to support green projects around the world, and particularly in developing countries. Those whilst it takes a long time to apply to for those grants, they can be very beneficial. One of the downsides, however, is that it does require approval and engagement with your own national government before any application can be made, and it can take a long time to be approved. However, there are some cities now that are seeing successes by working through the Green Climate Fund. In terms of the public sector, around the world, particularly in Latin America, and I know that we've not got that many Latin America cities on the call this time, in the afternoon we will do, there are municipal development funds. These are financing institutions that operate in one country. They're generally government owned, and they can provide a different range of financing support for projects in your own country. And so when you put all this together, you end up with quite a complex landscape of financing urban infrastructure. And so the first question might be to think about, well, where would you start with this? How would you actually look at what options you could use? And the key thing to think about is, well, what are you not able to use? So, for example, if your city cannot do public-private partnerships for whatever reason, you can just eliminate that course of inquiry. If your city is not able to issue bonds, you can scratch that off the list and start thinking about, well, what are you able to do, and what are you able to work on? And I think one of the key things that we must make sure cities have become better at is looking at the full range of financing options that are available, determining what's available for you in your specific circumstances that meet that project, but also that meet your particular rules that apply to your city, and then thinking about, well, what is the best possible financing option, and taking a very serious analysis to look at the different options, look at the pros and cons of each one, and consider how you might then take your project forward using different types of financing opportunities. This is something that we try and support our cities with, and we are working through different parts of C40 to help cities to understand how to look at the different types of financing mechanisms and options available. And if this is something you're interested in considering, then please get in touch, and we can support you. We can certainly show you how other cities have done this, and use that as a starting point for helping you think about the financing mechanisms. Of course, your finance department in the city will also have a lot of understanding of these areas. But one of the key objectives of this program in waste, looking at finance, is to help the officials that are leading on waste projects in the city to get really up to speed with some of the different financing options and mechanisms available. So that's the kind of introduction to financing urban infrastructure. We're going to move on to two different areas now, as I mentioned. The first is development banks, and thinking about what they do and how they operate. We're going to do that quite quickly, and then we're going to go on to look at PPPs in more detail, because I know that's a big area for this area of C40's work. So first of all, development banks. And so this complicated diagram, and I apologize for its complexity, is but it's important to show that it is a complex process. Looks at the development bank project cycle, and what this is about is going through the different areas that a development bank would work to help you move your project forward. And the reason why this is interesting from a development bank perspective is because they often start at an earlier stage than a private bank would do. Usually a private bank would expect you to have done all the work to prepare your project, and then come in right at the end and then provide loan approval, and then leave. You probably wouldn't hear from them much again unless you stopped paying your loan. Development banks take a different approach, and they start off right at the very beginning by having a partnership strategy with your country. And so somebody in your national government, possibly in the Treasury Department of the national government, will have worked with the development banks to develop a partnership strategy. Now, this is a very important document. It's updated every 3 or 4 years, and it highlights and outlines all the different areas that the development bank, the particular development bank, is planning to work in that country over the period of time. If you want a project to be moving forwards with development bank support, it's quite important to engage with the people in your national government that develop this partnership strategy jointly with the development bank. What's the contents of that partnership strategy are a really key part of the plan that development bank will have to support your work in that entire country over a period of time. And if your project's not in there, it's going to be quite hard to get that project moving forwards over that period. Once your project's inside there and the projects have been identified, then it's moving into look at the projects in more detail. The development banks support and often support feasibility studies and preparation of projects. And then implementation of those feasibility studies, and that's a very important aspect, because what we find in C40 is that one of the biggest areas where cities struggle is getting a project from being an idea to being something that people would invest in. And that's called project preparation. It's about getting the feasibility study done, which determines and shows through all the different evidence and expertise available that the project is viable, that it's going to work, and that it's going to achieve the objectives that you have as a city, but also repay the loan that's been taken out for it. And so that feasibility study is a very important document. And an area where development banks are different from every other bank is that they might help provide support to work with you on that feasibility study and to get that feasibility study moving forward. Once that's all happened, then it starts moving forward a bit more like a traditional bank would work. It moves into processing of the loan and negotiations around the loan. Of course, it's very important to think that the offer you've been made is not necessarily the final offer. It's very important to shop around. We've seen cities in the past that get one offer from a development bank and are determined to take that without really looking around and thinking about, well, what other financing mechanisms and options are available from other banks. So it's very important to start to think at an early stage about how you're going to negotiate the terms of that loan, and do those terms meet the needs of you as the project owner in the city. At this point, once the loan's been approved, that's where most private sector banks that's the only element that they engage in part 5 and 6. But for the development banks, because they have a wider objective of supporting the broader development of the city and the country, they take some engagement in the loan afterwards as well, and try and determine the effectiveness, not just from a financial perspective, but from a development perspective as well. And so they're looking at, well, did the loan achieve certain objectives for the city? Did the project work? Did it operate in the way that was planned? Did it achieve objectives in the city in terms of climate change or poverty alleviation or equity or job creation? So these are all areas that the banks take an interest in as they move through to their evaluation process. So what we see, this is some of the major development banks of the world. They operate in most of the regions of the world that we work in. So there's in Latin America, there's the Inter-American Development Bank and the CAF, which is the Development Bank of Latin America. In Africa, there is the African Development Bank, of course, and the Development Bank of Southern Africa. In Europe, there's the European Investment Bank, which does lend additionally to countries outside of Europe. And for Eastern Europe, there's the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And then in Asia, there is the Asian Development Bank and the new Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. There's also, for those of you in Brazil, Russia, India, and China, there's the New Development Bank, as well as lots of country-specific banks that work with specific countries, or indeed what are called bilateral development banks, such as the KfW, which is the German Development Bank, or AFD, which is the French Development Bank. So there's lots of different people working in these areas, and lots of different places that you can turn to. I would not recommend that you contact these guys directly. I think before thinking about having any contact with a development bank, speak to your city's finance department. They may well have previous experience with development banks, and try to identify the people in your national government who have contact with these banks, because there certainly will be people there who can advise and support you to take forward work in these banks. It's very complicated to engage in development banks. It takes a long time. Developing good relationships is really important, but making sure that you have strong support from across the city, from the city finance department and from the national government, is going to be crucial in getting anything approved and agreed with any development bank. So that brings us on to the kind of pros and cons of working with development banks. The main pros are, of course, as I said, concessional finance. And what that means is the money that development banks have is backed up by for example, the United States and some European countries. And that means that the cost of lending is considerably lower, or they can lend at considerably lower interest rates than other private banks would be able to do, which of course makes your project much more affordable, and it allows for projects to be financed, even if they're slightly risky projects, at a lower cost of finance than you might be able to get elsewhere. That's the really major benefit of development banks. Of course, I also mentioned that they do carefully analyze the project and work with you to help ensure the project is successful. They have a wide mission, which is not just about lending money, but it's about achieving wider benefits in the countries that they operate. And so they want to see the project being as successful as possible, as do you. And so they'll support you to make that happen. I said, of course, they have a wide range of criteria, not just the project finances. On some levels, that could be a negative aspect because they're looking much more widely than just at the project's finances. But I think you would all agree that it's very important that projects that the city develops don't just have good financial models, but that actually can help the city move forwards in some of the wider social and economic issues that the city is facing. And the final positive element of development banks is that they can provide technical support at a very early stage. They can support project preparation. They've got money and sometimes even grants to support this in a way that private finance people do not have. Of course, the negatives, there are some negatives. Development bank loans take a huge amount of time to approve and process, anywhere between 3 and 6 years. And one of the challenges that we find is this often prevents cities from getting a loan approved in the time of the mayor. And so it has to be a multi-mayoral approach, and something that the mayors agree from one to another during that transition is going to be moved forward. Like I said, most banks only work with national governments, and so you have to make sure that your project is incorporated into the national plan for that bank. And quite often they only lend to national governments, so you have to have a very strong relationship with your national government that is a priority for them as well. And then the final issue, and this may sound more of a technical issue, but they often only lend in external currencies. For example, the World Bank usually lends in US dollars. That is a problem for most of our cities because the money that you have coming in is in local currency, it's in your currency, and the money that you will then be repaying is in a different currency. What if that currency conversion rate should change quite substantially? And we've seen that over the last year. Many countries' currency conversions have changed because the US dollar has been quite strong. And so the lending or the repayments you have to make are suddenly much higher through no fault of your own, and it can really throw off your project financing and structures. So that's the end of the development bank section. I just want to talk quickly about creditworthiness because it's a concept that you all hear about. So we'll come back to our Tesla example, and you'll remember that we talked about the financing and the funding is the repayments. If that funding should stop for any reason, or if you should stop making those payments, that is called a default. And really the definition of creditworthiness is the likelihood of a default happening. And so the credit rating is really an assessment of the risk of you defaulting or anybody defaulting on the repayments of that loan. And it's usually written in a letter system, so AAA or AAA being the best, moving down, and that gives investors and lenders a very clear idea of using the same system of what every type of project is, or the risk of every type of project is that they're going to invest in. Many cities do not have a credit rating or have quite a low credit rating. And this is one of the major challenges that we see. What that ultimately does is it makes the cost of borrowing higher because the investors perceive the risk to be higher to their capital. So the core challenges that we see cities have when it comes to creditworthiness are low revenue collection rates, and by that I mean generally tax collection. We have some cities in our network that have very, very low rates of tax collection, and if that sounds familiar to you, that in my mind is one of the areas that you should really think about being able to improve in your city. And in the waste context, it's about tariff collection and about making sure that you're actually getting in the income that you should be having. That's a really important part of making sure your projects are viable. Obviously, accounting practices and budgeting and sticking to budgets is really important from a creditworthiness perspective, and planning, particularly planning for capital investments, are the other two big risks or challenges when it comes to city creditworthiness. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about project funding. As you remember, if you've got the Tesla again, you've got the financing, but then you've got the funding. I'm not going to go into this in much detail because this will be the subject of a future webinar in the Municipal Solid Waste Program. But really just to say, there are 3 core ways that projects can be funded or that money can come in. And you need to think about where that money is going to come in to repay your project. The first, and they all begin with T, the first is tariffs. And so that would be potentially user charges. It's, the tariffs that you will maybe receive in waste is a payment or a fee per ton of waste that comes in. Another, of course, way of paying for things is taxes, which is quite broad taxation of the general population. And then there's transfers, which is money that comes from other governments or layers of government. So any money that comes to your city from the national government would be called a transfer. These are broadly the only 3 ways that money comes into cities. And so you've got to think about which of these, or where is the money going to come in to repay your project, and how is that going to be moving forward. So that's the broad overview of financing, including development bank financing. I promised that we'd go on to public-private partnerships, and that's what we're going to do now. And so the definition of a public-private partnership is basically an agreement between the public sector and the private sector to deliver a public service. And coming with that is a full or partial transfer of risk from the city or from the public sector to the private sector. So basically it's about taking some of the project delivery and passing it over to the private sector, and with that taking some of the risks and passing that along to the private sector as well. And the extent to which those services are pushed or devolved to the private sector and the extent to which the risks are transferred to the private sector vary quite considerably by different types of contracting. And so all of the detail about the risks, who takes those risks, where the risks are, who does what, are written in the detailed contracts and legal agreements that are made between the private sector operator and you guys as the city. And so those contracts are absolutely vital to get right. A lot of the time we think of the private sector as they're there just to make money. They only have one objective. Of course, you do need to bear in mind that that is their core objective, is to make money. But the way that they're going to do that is by delivering the service that they have contracted to do. And it is not in their interest more broadly that they should fail in that. But it's, of course, one of the challenges is it's not in your interest that they should fail either, because then you have to have the problem of dealing with a failed contract, which can take a lot of effort to resolve. So across the municipal solid waste sector, there are opportunities for public-private partnerships across the full spectrum of activity. So starting at the very beginning, thinking about planning the waste process and optimizing the processes, moving into actual physically taking action, so collecting the waste, transferring the waste, even separation of waste can be done through a PPP, and then moving on to waste disposal and recycling and energy recovery. And we've seen examples around the world of public-private partnerships operating in each of these different areas, which is really the full cycle of the municipal solid waste system. And we see cities and public and private sector operators working in partnership in a whole range of different areas around these spaces. So the objectives of a PPP broadly would be, first of all, to reduce the use of the city's own funds. Very often the reason for entering a PPP in the first place is because the city hasn't or isn't able to raise the financing. So the previous slides where we've talked about some of the financing challenges, sometimes those challenges are so great the city is not able to raise the financing, or decides to use their financing capacity for other things, and so uses instead a PPP model to bring in private sector money that can deliver the services. Of course, in some circumstances, the quality of services can be delivered for very high quality. Partly that's because the people delivering services are experts in doing so. They do that around the world, and you might want them to come into your city to do that. Again, that could potentially achieve good value for money as well. That partly through economies of scale, partly because tendering these things out to private operators means they're competing with each other and looking to do things for the lowest costs. You can also get very high standards of operation and maintenance, and as I said, mobilize investment from the private sector. But the key thing you absolutely have to bear in mind with a PPP is you can only achieve these goals and objectives if you do the right contracting. If you fail to get the right contract, if you allow a tender to be issued that doesn't have all the controls, that doesn't specify exactly what the quality in terms of standards should be, that doesn't look at the standards of operation and maintenance, then you may not achieve some of these goals. And in fact, you may end up in a worse position than when you started, or if you'd done things in a different way, because the company that you're contracting with may not be contracted to do the things you want them to do. And so it's very, very important to work very hard to get these contract elements done correctly. So some of the key elements or key contracting elements that you might want to think about are, first of all, what are the services that you need to operate or that you want to be operated? And then think very carefully about the structure around which you'll do that. And we're going to talk about some of the different types of PPP contracting structures in a few minutes. It's very important to think very carefully and be very, very clear to specify what the technical outputs are and what standards you want to have met. And including in that, thinking through, well, what are the penalties for failure to deliver? So if your contracted waste operator doesn't deliver to the standards that you want, first of all, how do you prove that? And how do you do that? Prove that in a legal way or in a way that the contract can specify. And then what are the penalties for failing to do that? Some circumstances they can be financial penalties. They could actually be withdrawal of the contract. And think through what would be the implications of applying those different penalties if the service is not delivered to the standards that you expect and that you specify in the contract. Of course, it's also very important to think about what is the transparent process for operator selection. How are you going to select the right operator and make sure that they do the things that you want them to do, and you get the best possible bidder with the most skills, experience, and best value for money of your contract. You might want to think about what is the role of the city in regulation and enforcement. So what would you be doing as the manager of that contract from the city perspective? You want to think about the payments, how those payments will be made, who gets paid what from where, and specifically, what are the circumstances around which payments wouldn't be paid, and how would you go about having those discussions and negotiations and enacting any clause in a contract that talks about or that allows for payments not to be made. And finally, you need to think very carefully about where the risks are, what risks are being shifted, but what risks you maintain as the city, and be very clear and aware of the risks that you still hold from working on a PPP. So here's a basic diagram. It's very basic. There's other things that would go in here in a more complex diagram, but more on a very broad level, you've got your project company, which is your private operator in the middle. And down the bottom, they get a concession agreement. The starting point, they get a concession agreement from the government, and that will determine all the contracting elements, what they have to deliver, how they're going to deliver it. It might include a support agreement, which provides more information on the support that the government or the city will be providing. At the other side, they're going to get revenue from somewhere. So there has to be some money going into the project company in some way, most broadly because they have to repay any debt or equity that they've taken out to structure the project. And so where will that revenue come from in this space? It's usually from waste generators. It may be revenue from the government as well, if there's some element of subsidy there. And then finally, at the top, the project or the company or the operator needs to get some money through the door to build the project in the first place. And that's usually by, way of financing. And there's two ways that comes into that company. The first is they borrow money. And the second is that they sell shares in their project, and that's called equity. And so this is at very broad level, what the company, or the operator in the middle, the different contracts that they're having to sign and develop, and the different things they're having to think about if they want to do a PPP arrangement with you. So I said that there were different types of contracting and types of concessions, and there's four main types that are common in the waste sector, and they all start with, they all have different acronyms. The first is build, own, operate, and transfer, and that's where the project company they take the contract to design, build, own and operate the project. And so they have the full responsibility to own and operate the project once they built it. They earn revenues during the period of the contract, so that period of time could be maybe 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And importantly, at the end of the contracting period, the ownership of that operation moves back to the public sector. So, for example, if your contract is for 20 years, the day after the 20 years is up, you own that asset, you own that operation as the city, and then you can choose how you want to operate it. Sometimes it's reached the end of its useful life, sometimes it's still perfectly viable to continue operating yourself. Other times you might want to think about, is there another company that can operate it on an ongoing basis? The second type of contract is build, operate, transfer. That's where the project company, they construct the project, they earn revenues from its operation, but its ownership always remains with the private sector. So this is where the project company builds and operates the project, but the city or the public sector always owns the project. Then you've got build, transfer, operate. And I've got a diagram in a second that explains these in more detail, which is where the private sector builds the project, but the public sector doesn't take ownership of it until the construction is completed. And then finally, you've got build, own, and operate, which is where the ownership is always with the company that's building it. So it's never owned by the city. And so the ongoing value of the project, even after the contract is over, is still retained by the private company. And so this shows them in a different way. In all these types of concessions, you have the private sector building the project and operating the project. The main key difference is about ownership and who owns the project. So whether it's at the end of the contract period, whether it's always, whether it's at the end of construction, or sometimes whether it's never. So we're going to go into a bit more detail now on the PPP development process and what steps broadly you might need to take as a city to develop a PPP. So first of all, the very first thing you need to think about is to determine whether what advisors you might need to help you to develop these contracts. I would strongly recommend that you do consider bringing on specifically legal, technical, and transaction advisors. These people are experts globally in working on these areas. They will have a very clear understanding of the laws that apply in your country to these projects, and will be the sort of people that can help you avoid getting into any sort of problems with your project. You then want to think about the objectives, identify the risks, and do some financial modeling. It might be that you need new regulations in your city as well, and so those have got to be created and put through your city government, or maybe even your national government if the PPP regulations don't allow for the sort of project you want to create. Of course, then at that point, you've got to think about, well, what is the detail of the contract, and start preparing that. You've got to do a tender process, which involves getting bidders interested, or certainly make people aware of the opportunity to bid on this process. It will take bidders quite a long time and probably quite a lot of money for them individually to prepare a bid for your project. So you might want to do that in several stages. Finally, once you've done your tender process, you want to select your winner. You'll sign some sort of letter of intent or MOU prior to signing contracts, at which point they'll be able to start thinking about how to raise capital, sign all the detailed contracts with you, and then they take over. So they then start the construction, they do the operation, and if there is a transfer of ownership at the end of the project, that will then happen at the end of the contract. Things to think about when doing the tendering, because that's one of the most important elements of a PPP, is maybe doing a pre-qualification. And in that sense, what you want to do is you want to invite everybody that's expressed an interest to demonstrate that they actually are capable of running the project. Are they technically capable? Are they financially capable? Do they have any previous experience or any qualifications in how to do this? If the answer is no to these, it might be that you want to seriously consider whether they should be even invited to submit a full bid. What you want is people or companies that are experts in making these projects work. Then you can get a shortlist and invite those people to submit a full bid. And I think importantly, you should think about what is the transparent process of doing the technical and financial evaluation of those bids. I'm running a little short on time, so I'm just gonna run through these relatively quickly. But I think the other part of a PPP is to think about the risks and assessing the risks very objectively that you're taking on, but also that a bidder would be taking on. I'll leave this PowerPoint with you so you can have a look at some of these common risks. But the key thing I want to say is that you think through very carefully what these risks are. Be very, very careful of a company or somebody coming in and offering you the very first type or example of a project in the world, or very first example of a type of project in your country. That is likely to bring problems. There may well be a good reason why it's never been done before in your country or in the world, and think very carefully whether that is something you want to do. The other thing you've got to think about is, although you're transferring some of the risks to the private sector, if those risks materialize and the private sector ends up not being able to fulfill the contract, you've got to think about the risk that presents to the city. Particularly, what is the risk of not having a waste collection or disposal system for a period of time? And what would that mean? What would be the implications of that for you and for your city? And how would you mitigate that if your contractor maybe went bankrupt, if your contractor wasn't able to fulfill the contract in the way that you want? In many respects, the contractor knows that you won't want to cancel it because, of course, the problems that will present to the city are very high. And so that could leave you in quite a tricky situation with your contractors. So that's broadly the kind of areas that I wanted to talk about when it comes to PPPs. The final thing to say in terms of challenge areas is that project preparation can be a very painstaking, slow, laborious process, but it's so important that you spend the extra time to get it right. Because the more time you spend on this, the more that effort will be rewarded in having a really solid and stable contract at the end. So that's it for me. There's some further reading on a lot of these areas. The C40C's finance facility has published a explainer called How to Finance Urban Infrastructure, and the link to find that is here. Also, we'll email that out to you at the end of this presentation. And finally, just want to say a big thank you to our partners, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, who support the Municipal Solid Waste Finance Program, and City Foundation, who support the C40 Financing Sustainable Cities Initiative. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. That was a lot of very interesting content in a brief amount of time. So thank you very much for summarizing so well. We're going to open the floor to questions in a couple of minutes. I was just going to summarize some of the very briefly some of the fundamental points that James touched upon. So we looked at financing and funding today. So at the initial cost of the investment, and then at the operating costs, so at running this waste infrastructure. And in waste, the initial capital expense is actually the lower part of the investment. So you have not won the battle when you have found a loan, a grant, or the money to build the infrastructure. Most of the costs are going to come later when you are running it. We also looked at development banks and how they have some benefits, like the fact that they can provide more technical support at earlier stage of the process, but also at some of the disadvantages of working with development banks, that they need national government involvement to some extent, that they have a very long project approval process. I think James said between 3 and 6 years, which means that it's probably going to be across more than one mayor, the whole process. And this, as people who work in cities, I'm sure you appreciate, can create some difficulties. And the fact that you will often have to repay the loans provided by development banks in either dollars or euros. And if your currency, your local currency, is not so stable, this might mean that the repayments you will have to make could be much higher than you were expecting due to the changes in exchange rate, to the fluctuations in exchange rate. We looked at PPPs and the fact that you are bringing a private contractor in to a public service. you are they are not there because they are your friends. They are of course there to make money, but you are still on the same side. So both of you want waste collection services to carry on smoothly in the city. So while you might have different ambitions and motivations, you are still very much having the same objectives. It's very important to define performance targets. We've seen that a lot of cities, for example, have included increases in recycling rates in their request for proposals, and this is a very good way of increasing recycling in a city. You don't necessarily have to define how you want the private partner to achieve these objectives, but you might include in a contract a requirement to increase recycling by 2% a year, for example. It's then up to the private contractor to find the way of achieving this objective. We looked at roles and responsibilities and how it's very important at the beginning of the contract to understand exactly who will be doing what in the contract and who is responsible for the risks. So identifying the risks, but also responsibility for those risks. User fees. We need the user fees to finance, to fund the activities, but whose responsibility is it to collect those fees? Is it the private or the public, for example? And the use of advisors is another thing we looked at, particularly if it's a new technology in your country or in your city or in your, well, in your city maybe not, in your country or in your side of the world. If it's the first technology of the sort being proposed, be extra careful, because either there is a reason for that technology not being implemented in your area before, or in general, it will need to be contextualized to some extent. You will need to really adapt that solution to your local context. This is fundamental. We have so much waste infrastructure across our regions that was built and that was then abandoned because there wasn't the money for it to run it, because there wasn't considerations on how it should be run, because the waste composition in your city is not the right one for that technology. There are so many reasons, and it's very important to look at these. Once again, James, thank you very much. I'm opening the floor for 2 questions, which you can either mute or unmute, or I see a couple in the box here. We have one from Divya from Delhi. What are the type of concession models with regards to PPPs that you have come across most in Global South cities? In the Global South? Yeah,
great question. Thank you. I think all of these different types have been applicable across the world. You know, this is Global South and Global North, and we've seen these models all operating across the world. I think, and it kind of comes to the next question, which is kind of similar as well, which is, I think it's not about which is most preferable. I think it's about which one best meets the needs of you in your specific city. And this is why I was very keen to stress this point about getting really good advisors on board that can give you really clear advice and guidance on which type of project support or project type you might want to think about. You know, don't think about which one's been used elsewhere the most or which one is most preferable. It's about what you need. What is the solution that you need? What are the risks you're prepared to take? What do you want to have left at the end of the contract? Is the asset going to be worth anything? Do you think that it's going to be is it going to be something that you want to potentially operate after the contract? You know, and of course, in the different types of contract will affect how much you have to pay now and how much the operator needs to be paying now, and so how much they need to be getting back. So if they're going to be continually owning an asset, they may think about that being a more long-term investment than if they're going to have a short-term contract where they don't own the asset at the end. So this is why the importance of getting really good advice and getting you know, thinking through your different range of options and making sure that you look at every different type of option available. I know that's not really a full answer, but I think broadly, all of the options, I've presented all the options because all the options are open to you, and all the options are open for you to think through, and to make you aware of the different types.
Excellent. Thank you, James. So I think this also answers then Ibrahim's from Nairobi's first question of how which would be the most preferable type of PPP, because it very much depends on your current situation and context. Then Divya again from Delhi was, I think, making a consideration that PPPs can be more appealing because if a city, and a lot of our cities don't have a very good credit rating, they would be less interesting. It's less likely that a development bank will give you a loan if your credit rating is generally quite low as a city, and therefore in that case the private sector option might be more easier to find an investor.
I think Divya is also making the point that sometimes it's not, you don't just have to think about the city being able to borrow money, but actually the corporation may well need to borrow money to make or construct the project in the first place. And quite often corporations don't have a very
corporations in India are cities for those who are less with the Indian context.
but there was a broader issue that thinking about if a company is coming in, you've got to think about where that company is going to get money from as well. And so a company will have to borrow money, but a company has the added benefit than a city does, because a company can actually issue shares and issue equity in the company. So other people can take ownership or part ownership of the company and then put in money as an investment rather than putting in money as a loan. And so companies do have access. But yeah, this is one of the key issues that we see PPPs being used for, is because the city doesn't have the credit rating.
Mm-hmm. So as you have seen, some poll questions should have come up on your screen. We would be very grateful if you could take a second to answer those while we keep going on questions. From Ibrahim, is it possible to get a PPP in which collection can also be transferred to the investor? Absolutely, yes. As James highlighted, every part of the waste model can be attributed to a private company. We do not encourage, though, more than one part of the model to be assigned to the same company. So if one company is doing collection, we would generally not find the same company also doing disposal, for example. So if one company is operating the landfill, you will probably want a different company working on collection. There are very few successful examples where the same company was contracted to do collection, transport, treatment, and final disposal. So it's what we have seen in the most successful examples is that if you do want to contract out the whole of waste management, do different parts of the process to different companies.
And I think that's part of the risk sharing as well, and that's the primary reason why you would do that. If you have one company that's running the entire system in your entire waste collection system, and something happens to that company, what then happens to your whole waste collection system? And getting somebody, and another company or another provider in to do that could be a huge undertaking for you as a city. So yeah, there's a key risk sharing or spreading element of that.
Excellent. I don't know if we have any more questions. We don't have any in the chat box. If anybody wants to unmute their microphone. Otherwise, we are at the end of our hour. James has very kindly said that he remains available for answering questions you may have. His email is on the screen. Do copy us, myself and Gisela, in the email if you reach out to James so that we can coordinate that. And in general, when you are looking at PPPs or development banks or just any kind of financing on your waste infrastructure projects, involve us. We are very much here to support you. in whatever way we can in helping you define the best road for your own city. Oh, Leah has a question.
Thank you very much. Yes, just a brief one. For cities, hopefully the answer will be brief, but for cities with high degree of informality, so where a lot of kind of organic ways that things are happening with the waste sector, and for governments that are trying to move towards a more structured PPP approach, what are some of the key intervention points that you think, and the responsibility of like in the formalizing the PPP scoping and then also in implementing the PPP? So the government engagement with these informal sectors, and also the responsibility for like the private entity to engage with those entities in the process. How do you kind of bring the informality into the structure that you've seen? Thanks.
Do you want, shall I take this one, James?
You start and I'll add.
So about 50 to 70% of employment across our cities in Latin America, Africa, and Asia is in the informal sector. It is a huge challenge, and one that it's part of the system. There will always be the informal sector in waste management. It's a reality that we have to come to grips with. So it's a matter of fighting them or involving them. And involving the informal sector is by far the most successful practice that we have seen. It goes through a process. There is the formalization of the workers, usually into cooperatives. This gives them ability for representation, also for credit. So if you are in a cooperative, you're more likely to get a small loan to buy a cart for collecting rubbish or whatever. And also with regards to selling the recyclables, because if one collector collects 5 kilos of PET bottles a day and sells them, he'll sell them for a price. If 10 of them get together and sell 50, they'll obviously sell at a different price. And once they are into cooperatives, once they've been formalized into legal entities, then you can actually tender out parts of the service for these cooperatives. Cities in Latin America, particularly Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, and Sao Paulo, have done this successfully to some extent, and they actually in Buenos Aires, they in the cooperatives, which are now formal, no longer informal, recycle I think 2,000 tons of waste every month, which is quite I think it was 400 tons a day actually. So quite a significant part of recycling can actually be then attributed to the cooperatives, but you have to go through this process beforehand to actually get them there. And Leah, we have a lot of material on that, and we'll be doing a lot on this going forward. So happy to reach out if you wish to go into this further.
Also, just to share the point you made, Federico, on bringing the informal sector in Durban, in South Africa. We're working right now on a program which has a waste component to it. It's predominantly a stormwater adaptation program, which is about clearing all the waste from the stormwater drainage system across Durban. And what we're supporting the city to do, and they've worked very, very successfully so far, the city has been getting local cooperatives, exactly as you described, Federico, of people working, previously informal people who have come together. They now have a contract from the city to maintain and clean a specific area of the stormwater drainage system, which is broadly big streams and ducts across the city. And so those people now have this kind of semi-formalized employment in cooperatives that's bringing steady income streams and also delivering the service for the city. So it's an interesting example. Which
is this in Durban or in Dar es Salaam?
That's Durban. That's Durban.
Okay, because we're doing something similar. We're starting to do something similar in Dar es Salaam as well. So good that this trend is spreading. Excellent. We have another question from Willie from Medan City. Taking lessons learned from other countries, how long does it take on average for contracting a private partner in sustainable in the waste model? Can you provide, James, a general indication of the process duration for contracting PPPs?
So the contracting process can take anywhere from, I would say, 9 months or so to a couple of years. You've got to, to allow a reasonable amount of time to do this. You can't rush this, and it's really important not to rush this. You've got to spend the time getting a really, really good contracting model together, working out exactly what you want to achieve, how the finances are going to flow, what the risks are. That takes time. Don't rush it. Please don't rush it, because if you rush it, you may well forget something and really regret it for a long number of years to come. And there are cities across the world that have done things that they regret. I think one of the good examples is a city in the US put all of their parking spaces to PPP. And what it now means is they cannot change the street design of any of their streets at all, because the PPP contractor owns all the parking spaces for the next 2 decades. And so they want to put in cycleways, they want to be changing streets, and they are unable to do so because they put PPPs for all their parking spaces. So it's not a waste example, but it's an example of being locked into something by not thinking through the implications of the contract.
Sorry.
So I was just going to say, I think I don't know if the other part of if the question is the other way around, though, is what is the average length of a contract in terms of how long, how many years is somebody contracted for? I don't actually know the answer. This would be something that I'd be
around 10 years in waste generally.
About 10 years in waste, brilliant.
Because generally the infrastructure cost is quite high, so usually we look at around 10 years, or private companies require. Usually about 10 years of concession to make sure that they make their money back. Sometimes it can be less. We don't recommend making it too short. 1 year, 2 years, really under 5 years is a very difficult. It just puts a lot of stress on the whole relationship to make sure that the private company also makes their money back from the investment. And the final part of Willie's question, who is usually taking responsibility for initiating the project? The government, the private sector, and who usually prepares the outline and final business case for scheme or partnership? So we see all of this happening. It's very often happens that you get an unsolicited bill, that some person has a presentation of this technology from another country, and they have connections in a city council, and they will present this unsolicited bid revolutionizing waste management in a city. Be very wary, be very careful about these type of suggestions, or in other cases they come from the government, and obviously they are more structured. Generally, the who prepares the final business case for scheme and partnership, again, this depends very much. If the city already does the feasibility analysis, the business plan, and everything, it makes it more interesting for private companies, because if a private company comes in and they have to do the feasibility analysis and they spend $100,000 to do that, and then it doesn't work, they've lost $100,000 and they haven't achieved anything. So if you want the private company to do it, this will make your project less appealing in general to private investors. But of course, it has its benefits as well. I don't know if James, you want to add anything on?
I just want to reiterate what you said. If somebody comes to you offering services, offering to take over part of your waste system, be very careful. The chances are, if one company is willing to do it, there'll be many companies that are willing to do it. And if someone's gone to all the effort to write you a letter or an email saying that they would be willing to do it and to think through the whole system, it might well be something you can think through whether it would make sense to do it. But definitely get people in, or think carefully. Start it off in exactly the same way as I've suggested before. Think very carefully about what you want. And because anyone coming in to you will be wanting to cherry pick the best bits and make as much money as possible. So put it out to transparent, open tender. That is the way that you get the best value for money. It's the way that you can assess all the different people in the market that are able to do the particular work that you want, and to get the job done that you want to have done, rather than what somebody has suggested.
Excellent. Thank you, James. Saddam, thank you, James, for the advice. I think there is a need for cities to explore using bonds to finance bonds, especially for projects that generate significant revenues. A lot of public investors that are interested in investing in these projects, hence the need to establish municipal bond frameworks. I'm going to leave this one to you, James.
Sure. So, yeah, around the world, cities are starting to think about bonds. The US cities have used bonds for decades. They're far ahead of the rest of the world in the use of bonds because there's specific tax treatment of bonds in the US. Many cities we find in C40 do not have the authority, the legal authority to issue bonds. And so it's well worth checking with your finance department whether this is something that you can do. Certainly, it would need to be led by the finance department of your city if you are to issue a bond, and usually it would need to be for quite a lot of money to make it worth it, because issuing a bond has huge legal expenses usually, and so it would need to be for a lot of money, but that's also usually okay. There are lots of projects that all cities are trying to do, so whether it includes waste, transport, and other areas, so that's not a problem in terms of the size of the money. What can be a challenge is usually the legal authority to issue a bond, and happy to share more information about what green bonds are. And we've got, as I said, we've got a brochure on what it means to issue a green bond, and the way that cities can get more investors potentially from issuing green bonds. But don't forget, a bond, like any other loan, you have to repay it, and so it's important that you think about, if you are taking on any sort of debt, that you think about where the revenue streams are going to come back from that allow you to repay that debt, or the way that you're going to repay that debt in future.
Lovely. So we are abundantly over time, but I see that unfortunately most people are still on the call. So thank you very much. I hope this was useful. I was going to say, particularly if you are embarking on PPP, we have also a lot of reference contracts from other cities who recently initiated a PPP, so we can send those to you as reference as well for the PPPs that you are looking to set up. So let us know if you would like us to share some of these PPP contracts from other cities with you. For the rest, thank you very much, James, for your fantastic presentation, questions, answers, and everything. And thank you all very, very much for joining. We will talk again very soon. Have a lovely day.
Thanks, folks. Bye.
Bye.